Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Edelman, and I'm a program analyst for the Division of Energy Assistance with the Office of Community Services. On behalf of OCS, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This webinar will provide a 60-minute review of the FY 2022 Performance Data Form Module 2, that is the Performance Measures Report. Today's webinar will be presented by Melissa Torgerson of Verve Associates and Dan Bausch of Apprise. The purposes of this webinar are to review the key requirements for completing the performance measures module of the FY 2022 LIHEAP Performance Data Form, that is Module 2. Also to explain the approach for reporting on supplemental funds, including LIHEAP American Rescue Plan Act or ARPA funds, to highlight key reminders and ways to avoid common reporting issues, and to review examples of different reporting scenarios. The audience for today's webinar includes LIHEAP coordinators and other staff who work on completing the performance measures module. We greatly appreciate you joining us today, and we hope that this webinar is helpful to you as you complete your FY 2022 performance data form. Dan, please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everybody. This is Dan Bausch from Apprise. Happy to be here with you again for another training webinar. Thank you for your time. We know we've had a lot the last few weeks, so we really appreciate your time. Today's webinar is a 60-minute webinar focused on Module 2 for the performance measures. We have a handout right now that has the slides, and we're going to add a handout with the spreadsheet that we also had in the last webinar for the grantee survey module 1. So those are under the handouts part of your GoToWebinar sidebar. We're recording the webinar today, and then we're repeating this webinar for other grant recipients or other staff in your office or other contractors who couldn't attend today. This will be repeated on January 12th. You don't need to attend both. So if you're here today and have a good understanding, you don't need to attend the next one. So we do enjoy getting questions from you all. That helps us to make sure we're giving you the right information, and we want to be able to help you as you're collecting the information or preparing your report. There's a question box. You can type your questions in, and we will take questions at the end and follow up with any state-specific questions. Here is our outline for today. We're going to spend some time on the main module, Module 2A, some time on the other two tabs where you report on supplemental funding. And we're going to look at some examples and remind you of the data validation and final reminders for submitting the report. So we want to start with this poll again. We've had in some of the past webinars. How experienced are you with working on the performance measures, which is Module 2? Not at all. This is brand new. Not too much, 1 or 2 years. Somewhat experienced, 3 or 4 years, or very experienced, 5 or more years. So we'll give you a little bit of time here to answer the poll. All right, looks like they're coming in. We'll give it another 10 seconds. All right, Nicholas, let's close the poll. All right, so about a third of you, this is brand new. So we're hoping that this will help give you a good starting framework for the report. Then we have a spread of people, another third with some experience. So we'll work to incorporate that as we go today. All right, so we're going to start with just talking about where the performance measures fits. So if you were at the grantee survey training last week, even if you weren't, it's important to remember that the performance measures report is part of a larger report called the LIHEAP performance data form. That form consists of 3 different modules, 2 of them that are mandatory and required. The grantee survey, where you report on your funds that were available during the federal fiscal year and how those funds were obligated. And then module 2 is the performance measures, where you're reporting on the impacts of LIHEAP assistance during the federal fiscal year. There's a 3rd module that's optional for extra performance measures data. Some grant recipients do fill that in. That's more for their own benefit and use to track metrics over time. So module 1 and 2 are in one report, but they're really distinct in what they're asking for. Grantee survey, you'll need to get information usually from your fiscal folks. Performance measures, you'll need to get data from your data system and from energy vendors for your clients. So the performance measures began collection mandatorily in 2016 as part of the performance data form. And there are 3 different types of information or types of data that the performance measures are collecting. They're asking you for information so that energy burden can be calculated and looked at for a sample of households. That's in section 5. In section 6 of the report, you're asked to report on the number of instances where LIHEAP assistance helped a household that had lost energy service regain that energy service. So a household that is disconnected or runs out of fuel or has a broken heating system. And then section 7 is prevention of loss of energy service, and that's where you're asked to report on instances where a LIHEAP benefit helped a household that was at imminent risk of losing their energy service, such as they got a disconnection notice from their utility company, they come in for LIHEAP assistance, and they receive that assistance so they're not disconnected. So the performance measures in these 3 sections helps give OCS quantitative numbers, information, statistics on impacts and helps develop measures of targeting of how well households are being targeted with LIHEAP assistance. So where do these reports go? They do go into different places. They go to the LIHEAP report to Congress, which is submitted to the administration and Congress. They're put in the LIHEAP data warehouse. You can see this menu on the right side at the bottom. There's under energy burden, there's different reports you can get to look at performance measures data related to energy burden. They're used to help address inquiries from the administration and White House. And they are also useful for you when you're looking at your program or trying to help summarize your program for your own stakeholders, your own officials. So if we look at the next slide, the performance measures gets used to make one-page documents called executive summaries, performance measures executive summaries. And they take the information and put it into a format like this, so you can see what the average income was for households that were assisted, what the average energy bill was, and how much in LIHEAP assistance they received to reduce their energy burden. So if you want to look at these, we have a link at the end of the webinar showing where you can go find these. Okay, so where does this fit in with the other reports? So I went over this last time, but it's important each time. Model plan is what you're planning to do for the upcoming federal fiscal year. This lays out your plans and the types of assistance you'll be providing. The household report, the grantee survey, and the performance measures are all reports that are looking back on what occurred in the prior federal fiscal year. So the household report is, here's how many households were served with each type of assistance during that federal fiscal year. Grantee survey is, here's how those funds were obligated that we had available during that fiscal year. And performance measures is, here are statistics on the impact that LIHEAP assistance had on energy burdens and access to energy service during that federal fiscal year. Those are the main ones we're focusing on now. You also have the quarterly report, which is each quarter instead of annually. And that's a few indicators, key indicators, and the carryover report and SF 425, which are financial reports on the obligation of funds. Okay, so last year, the performance measures was revised so that there would be 3 tabs in the report. There was module 2A, 2B, and 2C. We're going to spend time looking at these today, but just as a reminder, 2A is your reporting performance information for all LIHEAP-assisted households during the fiscal year. So this is the same report that would have been done each year in the past. Then last year, they added 2B and 2C. 2B was where you would filter down and report all the same information just for households that were assisted with the LIHEAP CARES Act funds and had the data that was needed for the report. And 2C was where you would filter down and report on households that received the LIHEAP ARPA funds, if any, last year. So there were these 3 tabs, 2A, 2B, 2C. This year, there are no changes to the performance data form for 2022. So the form has the same requirements and data points as last year. There's no new items added to the report. There's nothing that's been removed from the report. So you should be able to use the same procedures or queries that you used last year. The only thing to keep in mind is some of you may have not used your ARPA funds for fiscal year 2021 when those funds were first awarded. You might have saved them to use them during 2022. So in that case, then this report will really be the first performance measures report where you're going to report information on that 3rd tab, tab module 2C. So the instructions from last year, the training materials are still applicable and can be referenced as you're preparing this year's report. As with the last report, OCS is anticipating right now that the performance data form will be submitted using Basecamp with an Excel spreadsheet. So they'll be providing those Excel spreadsheets soon with there'll be one for each specific state. The spreadsheet has some pre-populated information for the other module, module 1. So it's important to use that specific spreadsheet. The due date is still scheduled for January 31st, which was the date for several years initially. OCS is planning to communicate additional information about the report soon. If there's any changes to anything with the due date, you would hear about them in those communications. But right now, the due date's January 31st. All right, I'm going to turn it to Melissa, and we're going to look at that first tab, module 2A, all households.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the training. I hope you're all staying healthy and well during this heating season. We're going to talk about module 2A, which is the main tab for reporting on performance measures. And this is where you're going to report data related to LIHEAP impacts for all of your LIHEAP funds. As Dan noted, modules 2 and B are going to ask for the same kind of data, but they're going to actually break it out by funding source. This is not broken out by funding source. This is all your LIHEAP money in one tab. Next slide, please. So there are really 3 main sections in module 2A. Section 5 looks at energy burden targeting information. Section 6 looks at the restoration of lost energy service. And Section 7 looks at the prevention of loss of energy service. And we're going to go through each of these one by one, starting, next slide please, with Section 5. So next slide. This is what the report looks like. It's a little intimidating. There's a lot on there, but it makes me happy when I see all of those gray squares, because all of those are things you don't have to fill out. So that's a good thing. The rest is what we're going to talk about, starting with line A. So Part A looks at the total number of bill payment assisted households in FY22. From this, we're going to look at Part B, which is the amount of those households in Part A where you got 12 months of complete billing data, and then Part C, which is a further subset of those people with the billing data who had the highest energy burden. And we'll go into some detail here, which is, I know, really important for especially the new folks. To get started, kind of like when you're making a recipe, it's best to kind of have everything laid out and know where everything is to begin with. And this is kind of what this slide does, is it's telling you all the steps that you're going to have to take. You're going to have to identify the total households that receive bill payment assistance. And this, as you'll see, is the same statistic that you're generating for your household report, the bill payment assistance line. The only difference is that you're going to report it by main heating type. You're going to collect energy expenditure data from a sample of your energy vendors. Many of you have already started this. Some of you are getting ready to start this, but we'll talk about that a little bit. You're going to identify those households that you get complete annual expenditure data back for. You're going to use that collected data together with the data from your own database to calculate your statistics for Part B. And then you're going to take a portion of the households from Part B and calculate the same statistics for Part C. So let's walk through this. As I mentioned, line A is all households served with LIHEAP bill payment assistance in FY 2022. And this is going to be the same, it should match the number of households that you reported got bill payment assistance in your household report. So in this particular example, there are 30,000 households served in FY 2022 with LIHEAP bill payment assistance. And this is what you're going to put in Part A. And this is a picture of what that looks like. We've kind of, you'll see on these slides, we're going to progress and walk through what it looks like actually putting it into the report. Now, to underscore, Part B is actually a subset of Part A. So if you want to click ahead, I can't underscore this enough. You're not going out and grabbing a whole bunch of additional data. What you're doing is you're looking at of the 30,000 households, you can keep going with the animation, of the 30,000 households that you put in Part A, how many of those have complete expenditure data to put in Part B? And so in this example, 20,000 of the 30,000 households that got bill payment assistance, you were able to collect complete energy expenditure data. That means both their main heat and their electric data for. And so you were able to include those in Part B. Now I want to underscore something here. Some of you, because of the way your vendors are laid out, because you're still working on vendor agreements, for a number of reasons, some of you may not get as high as this 20,000 out of 30,000. And we always get a call, gosh, I'm throwing a lot of households out. I'm not including a lot of households in Part B because I don't have their complete data. And that's pretty normal. The goal, of course, over time is to increase the number of households you have complete data for in Part B, but you will be throwing out households, and there's nothing fun about that, and it feels wrong. And so I just want to tell you that that's normal, and that's something that we can work with you on, is how to increase that number over time. And Part C is the high burden households. Now remember, energy burden is the portion of your income that you spend on energy bills. And so we have 30,000 people who got bill payment assistance. We have 20,000 people in Part B who actually have all of their expenditure data. We have a complete data set for. Part C takes the top 25% of that 20,000 with the highest energy burden and then calculates the same statistics for them. So it's the same queries you're running that you're using in Part B, you're just running it on yet another subset of data. And so let's walk through and look at some examples and dive in just a little bit. We're going to break these into key steps. And the first step, the one that you all should be working on now or thinking about working on very strongly, is the collecting your annual bill amounts from your energy vendors. So for Section 5, you need to have energy bill data, and that includes main heat and electric. And so to do this, you're going to identify the top energy vendors for each main heating fuel type. You'll want to request annual expenditure data from a sample of these vendors. And remember that when you go to your electric vendors, you're not just collecting data for the people who got a LIHEAP benefit applied to their electric. You're also asking for data for those people who had a LIHEAP benefit applied to their main heat gas account, for example. So they may not have had a benefit applied to their electric, but you still may be requesting their electric data just so that you have a complete data set, main heat and electric. And then you're going to review that. Can you go back just a second? You're going to review that vendor data and keep your that's all valid, which means you have a complete data set. We have a lot of resources on this piece because we've summed it up in one nice pretty little slide, but this is a challenging part of the reporting. And so we have lots of resources we can point you to on how to choose a sample of vendors, which vendors you should be going to. We have templates for requesting the information from your vendors. So please, if you're new to this, give us a call. We'll point you in the right direction and we'll help you with whatever you need. Okay, next slide. So once you get all that expenditure data back from your vendors, you need to link it back to your program data so that basically you're calculating the following for each of your households. Their annual main heating expenditures, which is what you're going to get from the vendor, your annual electricity expenditures. If electric isn't the main heating fuel, you're also going to get that from the vendor. These other three you're going to actually pull from your own database: your annual household income, your main heating fuel type, and your total LIHEAP benefit amounts received for FY 2022. And that's the sum of all of their benefits that a household received. Some important reminders: in order for a household to be in Part B, they need a complete data set. So you need to be able to report on all of these 5 bullets here for every household that's included in Part B. And you need both main heating and electric, and you want to keep indicators of CARES and ARPA benefits together with this data. So for example, if you're putting all this data together like a chef, a sous chef to get started, you're not only going to want to have for each household these 5 bullets, but you're also going to want to have a flag on whether they received CARES and ARPA benefits, because if they do, you're going to pull them forward also into modules 2B and C. Once you've combined all the vendor and program data sets and identified households with complete energy bill, you're going to calculate the statistics for each main heating fuel type, as we just talked about: annual household income, average annual main heating bill amount, electricity bill amount, and LIHEAP benefits received. If you go to the next slide, there's a picture. I do better with pictures. You've calculated all the data for each household. Now you're going to basically place it into buckets for each main heating fuel type. So all the households with electric as their main heating fuel, you're going to want to put their average statistics in: natural gas, fuel oil, propane, and other fuels. All households will be auto-calculated. So you're just going to be popping them in for each of the main heating fuel types. So Section 5, Part C asks for average statistics for high burden households. So high burden households are the top 25% of households with the highest calculated energy burden from the households in Part B. And so I'm going to read these. I'm going to have you go to the next slide because there's a picture. We're going to follow along in the picture. As you can see, we have a little graph here, table with each household, and we have their main heating fuel, their annual income, their average or their annual residential energy bill, and their calculated energy burden. So we've got that laid out in a table. And in order to get the top 25 selected, we're going to do a couple things. First of all, you want to make sure that in step 1, which is this 1, 2, 3, 4th column over, you've actually added together their energy bill accurately. So this is their main heating fuel and their electric combined. That's their total residential energy bill. Step 2 is to calculate their energy burden. And so we do this by dividing their total residential energy bill by their annual income, making sure in my head that the math is right. And that is what you see in the 5th column. Now, this is a really important one. Are there any IT folks or programmers who are going to be putting together this report? This is an important step. Zero income households, you're going to get a division error or a potential error in your calculations because you're trying to divide 0 by whatever their energy bill is. And so for zero income households, we're going to go through and hard code basically their energy burden as 100%. So it doesn't need to be higher than 100%. We just want to calculate it at an even 100%. Step 4, you're going to do a sort. So if this was all in Excel, I would just basically select these all and sort them by that last column. And what that's going to do is really quickly point out to me the top the people with the highest energy burdens, and I'm going to select the top 25%. So I've actually seen states do this in Excel before. It's once you understand kind of what the calculations are, it's not difficult to choose the top 25%. One thing that's really important, can you go to the next slide? I think it's covered here. It's not, so going back. One of the things that's really important is that we're looking for the top 25% across all fuel types. So I'm sorry, Nicholas, can you go back to the screenshot? There we go. We don't want the top 25% of households in electric and the top 25% of households in natural gas, in fuel oil, and so on. We want you to take all of the households, get the top 25%, and they will fall across the categories as they may. So they're not going to be evenly distributed. That is something we see a lot of folks make that error. And so I guess I'm trying to point that out in advance. We're looking for you to find the top 25% across all households. And then they'll fall across each of the categories as they do, not 25% in each main heating fuel type. Is that clear, Dan? Did I make that clear enough?
Yep. Yeah, that's clear. And that's because, there are differences with the prices of fuel, of course, and the burdens households have. And what the performance measures is looking at is how well you're targeting households that have those highest energy burdens, which is looking at all households, not by each fuel.
All right. So now you can go to restoration. Now that energy burden, especially for new folks, that looks like a lot of work. A lot of you, though, have these automated in your systems. For some of you who don't, if you have questions, please give us a call. We really can help walk you through this. The next looks at LIHEAP restoration of lost energy services is section 6. And there aren't as many slides on this because it's not quite as difficult or technical, I should say. If you go to the next slide, what we're really looking at here is all occurrences or benefits that you gave out when the benefit restored energy service after it was already disconnected, when you delivered fuel to a home that was already out of fuel, or when you repaired or replaced inoperable energy equipment, which includes red tagged equipment or equipment that if turned on would be unsafe. So let's look at this in a little more detail. In this case, we're looking at occurrences of when LIHEAP assistance was used to restore energy service to a household that lost their home energy. So for example, if a household ran out of fuel twice and LIHEAP provided fuel to them on each occasion, it would be reported as two separate occurrences. So we ask for unduplicated stuff a lot in LIHEAP. This is not one of those cases. We're actually interested here in how many times you gave a benefit out in this particular that met this criteria. We are asking you to break those occurrences down by the fuel type to which the benefit was applied, and this may not be the household's main heating fuel type. So in section 5, we're asking you to parse all the data out by their main heating fuel type, even if that's not where the benefit was applied. In this situation, we're asking you to look specifically at where the benefit was applied when you record this data. So to complete this section, you're going to identify all the LIHEAP benefits you provided in FY 2022. You're going to identify the benefits that restored energy service that had been lost. So this includes benefits that reconnected shut-off utility service, benefits that provided a fuel delivery to a house that ran out of fuel, and the repair and replacement of equipment that was inoperable. So to give you an idea, by the way, many of you in your databases, your intake workers are clicking something like account status at the time of application or intake. So for example, they may be clicking already disconnected or already out of fuel. And those are the data that you're going to pull in order to determine whether a household meets these criteria. Just on this section and the next one, we have a lot of resources for helping to define the criteria and collect it from people. So in both the case of restoration and prevention, there's the piece about equipment repair and replacement. And for some of you, that may be done by your weatherization folks who may not be in your department. And so this might be something you need to request from them. And we do have templates for helping you to request that data and to define the criteria of what prevention and restoration really mean. So once again, lots of resources for those of you who are new and maybe struggling a bit with this. Section 7 looks at prevention of loss. So we just looked at restoration, which is you're already out of fuel, you're already disconnected, or you have an inoperable equipment. This is a little different because this we're talking about when LIHEAP actually prevents those things from happening. And you can go to the next slide. We talk about this in terms of imminent risk. So in this case, we have on the report form, this could be a past due notice or a utility disconnect notice. Imminent risk of running out of fuel. A good example in many states is you'll ask them to say whether they're at 25% of their tank or a certain percentage of their tank. So that's the criteria you might use to determine whether they're at imminent risk of running out soon. And repair and replacement of operable equipment to prevent imminent home energy loss. This is defined differently by different grantees. I always think about it as if you have an auditor that goes out and says, if we don't replace this furnace in the next 6 months, they're going to be without heat, or this is about to kick the bucket. Whatever. You may have very detailed criteria or pretty straightforward. We have some examples of that, but we're talking about operable equipment. It still works, but it is at imminent risk of not working soon. Next. It's the same, we're using the same key reminders, criteria for this data that we used for section 6, and that we're asking for occurrences, not unduplicated counts. So we know, for example, a person can come in and get a regular benefit that has a disconnect notice. A regular benefit might be applied to that. They're still at risk of disconnection. It doesn't have to be a crisis payment to cover that. So a person could come in and get a regular benefit. They could come in and get a crisis benefit, and then they could come in and get a cooling regular benefit and a cooling crisis. So they may have 4 different benefits throughout the year, all which are keeping them from getting disconnected because they have disconnect notices for each one. And all 4 of those should be counted based on the fuel type where the benefit was applied. Same steps, you're going to identify all the LIHEAP benefits provided in FY 2022, not households, benefits. And for each of those benefits, you're going to determine whether or not they prevented an upcoming disconnection, provided a fuel delivery when a household was low on fuel, or repaired or replaced equipment that was functional but failing. I'm going to turn it over to Dan now, who's going to talk about 2B and C.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time on 2A because that's the main module, and you collect data to then report information on it in that module. When we turn to 2B and 2C, those are the added tabs. 2B was added to report information related to CARES assistance, LIHEAP CARES assistance. 2C was added to report information related to LIHEAP ARPA assistance. With both of these tabs, the intention with adding them is that you go about collecting the data and completing the main module 2A. Then you take that data set that Melissa showed earlier with each household, their income, their main heating bill, their electric bill, their benefits, and you filter down for, let's say, module 2C, you filter down to households that received assistance with ARPA funds in some way, fully or partially. And you take that group of households and run the same statistics, just focused on those ARPA households and ARPA benefits. So same process, same procedures. 2B and 2C are taking it a step further by filtering down and looking at the supplemental funds. For many of you, 2B is not going to be applicable for the 2022 performance measures report because your CARES funds were all given out as benefits in prior years before federal fiscal year 2022. But for many of you, module 2C will be applicable because you did use ARPA funds to serve some portion of households during 2022. One really important point here is that the intention with the performance measures is that you'll figure out who the top energy vendors are. You'll make a data request to them to get LIHEAP clients' annual bill. For example, if it's an electric company, their annual electricity bill. The intention is you'll make the one request with for that information from the vendor. Not that you'll make a separate request for CARES or a separate request for ARPA. It's really make the request, complete that first tab, then use the information in your database to filter down to the households that receive the supplemental funds. So for example, here, if you provided LIHEAP to 30,000 households, like we showed earlier in the example with the graphics, for the supplemental funds, you'd need to figure out what portion of those 30,000 households received fully or partially funded ARPA or CARES assistance to report in each of those modules. All right, so we're going to look at this again graphically. So here's that 30,000 that received any kind of LIHEAP assistance. This is with regular funds, ARPA funds, CARES funds, any type of fund, infrastructure funds, any type could be included here. We need to figure out for 2B, the CARES module, how many got CARES assistance. That's our starting point. So that's represented here by the purple smaller circle within the blue circle. Now we're just going to focus on the purple circle for everything in module 2B. So let's say it was 20,000 households that got a benefit with CARES funds that happened to be remaining for 2022. You would report that in part A of module 2B. Let's see, keep going here. Then you would filter down to the households that had complete energy expenditure data. So that's represented here by the orange. Let's say it was 5,000 households. For those 5,000 households that you got the energy bill data for, that you used on the main tab 2A, you're just going to run all the same statistics on the average annual income, the average annual bill amounts. The only difference is you're looking at CARES households and you want to look at the average CARES benefit amount here. Then you'll also look at the top 25% and figure out of the top 25% the top 25% with the highest energy burden. What are their average annual income? What are their average annual bills? And produce all the same statistics. So same kind of filtering down process to complete section 5 for these extra modules. So this is CARES. Let's look at ARPA. It's the same process. Here's a circle representing households assisted with ARPA. Let's say that's 20,000 households. Then we'll focus in on the households that had complete data collected for part B, that's the energy expenditure data. Produce those statistics for that group, figure out each household's energy burden, identify the top 25% or the top quartile that has the highest energy burden, and we're going to report that in part C on the ARPA module, module 2C. So same process across each of these 3 tabs, just a different group of the population that you're looking at. Okay, so to be able to complete module 2B and 2C, there's 2 additional pieces of information you need to be looking at and thinking about in your data systems in this spreadsheet that we showed earlier of data items. If you did use any remaining CARES funds in 2022 that needed to be expended and you use those as benefits, you would need to know the CARES benefit amount a household received. And then if you utilize the LIHEAP ARPA funds, you would need to know the benefit amount that a household received from those ARPA funds. Those are the 2 key pieces of information to figure out which households apply to these modules and what the supplemental benefit amount is that you should use in section 5. So here again is that view of what your data set might look like, or a spreadsheet. This is each row is a household 1 to household 5. You need to have their main heating type. You collect their main heating bill from their vendor for a sample. You collect their electricity bill as well. And then you have the total amount of LIHEAP assistance they received during FY 2022. So we have this for each of these households in the table. And on the main module 2A, you would calculate the statistics using this group of households that has complete data. So that's shown on the bottom of the screen here. The additional items, as I mentioned, that you'd need to know if any of these households, some of their benefit was funded from CARES or ARPA. So if you look at household 1 here, they got a $525 amount in LIHEAP assistance. And we have an additional column here that says that of that $525, $100 was from CARES funds. Household 2 had $200 from ARPA funds. that helped with their $750 benefit. So with those additional fields, you can filter down to the right households and recalculate the statistics in the same way. So if we're looking at the ARPA module 2C, out of this spreadsheet, it's only households 2 and household 4 that received ARPA assistance. So we would take them and recalculate the same statistics on their annual main heating bill, their annual electric bill, and their annual ARPA benefit amount. So this is a really helpful 2 spreadsheets to give to anybody working with the data. When we turn our attention to the restoration and prevention parts of the report, and we're looking at Module 2B and 2C, you're again following the same rules that Melissa talked about of reporting occurrences, of looking at a household's status and when they received their LIHEAP assistance, if they were disconnected or if they were facing disconnection or out of fuel or at imminent risk of running out of fuel, for example. The only difference here is you need to know if a household that was, for example, disconnected, if when they received LIHEAP assistance, that assistance was paid in part or full by a supplemental funding source, either CARES or ARPA. So same process, but again, you need a way to identify if the funding used to provide their benefit consisted of any ARPA dollars or CARES dollars. So we'll look at some examples quickly. All right, so we're going to look at example 1 here. Here's a state that used ARPA funds to provide supplemental benefits. So they gave households their regular benefit, then they used ARPA dollars to give them a second benefit. So in 2022, this state served 50,000 households with bill payment assistance. So in the table on the bottom here on the main module 2A, we'll put 50,000 in part A. That's the total households that got bill payment assistance. This state used all their CARES funds in 2021. So we're going to put 0 for households that received CARES bill payment assistance. That's in module 2B, the middle column. So there's nothing that needs to get reported on that tab in the spreadsheet. Then they provided a $200 supplemental benefit to most households using their ARPA funds. So in this case, they look how many households received this. It was most. It happened to be 48,000 here. So that's in the first row of the column all the way on the right. Then they use those households. They filter down to the households that have data. They got data from their vendors for 25,000 households overall in module 2A. When they look at those 25,000 households and which received ARPA funds, it was 24,800. And they just take them and recalculate all the statistics for section 5, again for module 2C. One difference I want to point out here is if you look at the average benefit amount, which is in the middle of the table, if you look at the table, average benefit amount overall was $450. But when you look at module 2C, it's $200 because they used ARPA funds to provide a $200 supplemental benefit. So every household that got ARPA received $200. So the average benefit amount is $200 there. We go to another example, example 2. Here's a state that that used ARPA for targeted assistance. It says CARES here, but it should say ARPA on the top. So in this scenario, state Y served 30,000 households. So 30,000 again goes in part A of module 2A at the top of the table on the left. They used ARPA to provide the top 5,000 households with the highest arrearages, special assistance up to $3,000. So that's a more limited number of households, but could be a higher benefit amount. So since it was 5,000 households in that received the ARPA assistance, 5,000 goes in Part A. When you look down at the households with data for Part B, they got data for 20,000 households overall. That's used for Module 2A. They produce statistics for those 20,000 households on their average income and so forth on the left. When they look out of that group of 20,000, 3,000 were the households that received that special ARPA assistance. So they're going to take those 3,000 households and produce all the same statistics for them. Here, because that ARPA funds was used to provide arrearage assistance up to a higher amount, you can see the average benefit amount here is much higher for Module 2C, $1,500. And that's, again, just how they used the ARPA funds compared to how they used all their funds. All right, one last example is example 3 for restoration and prevention. So now we're looking at the later sections of the report on restoration and prevention. Let's say that this state, if a household applies for LIHEAP and is disconnected or got a disconnection notice, they get a crisis benefit to have their service restored or to pay the balance that they owe. This state provided 500 households with crisis assistance because they were disconnected, and 800 with crisis assistance because they had a past due notice. So for section 6, there's a line that says occurrences where energy service was restored after disconnection. We would put that 500, and then we would put the 800 on the past due notice or disconnection notice line in section 7. They did not use their CARES for crisis assistance, so we have 0 on the same lines on tab 2B. But they did use ARPA funds in 2022 to help 100 households that were shut off when the moratorium was lifted. So that 100 households would get reported in Module 2C on the restored after disconnection line. So these slides are in the deck that you can download. We encourage you to look at them in a little more depth, but we hope they're helpful for you. Okay, now here's another helpful item that we're not going to look at right now, but this is really a way to look at the different items in the report. The items are kind of going down in the rows, and the modules are going across in the columns. So this is just a helpful way of knowing what group you're looking at for each area of the report. All right, now we're going to wrap up with data validation and some final reminders before we do questions.
We're going to move through these quickly and we'll skip some slides, but as Dan mentioned, you all have the slide deck. So I encourage you to take a look. In your report, whether it's Excel or in OLDC, you're going to see a few things to help you. Calculated fields, which we mentioned already, we want to reduce your reporting burden. So wherever possible, we're going to use your data to auto-calculate fields. And they're also locked fields. So these are fields that you won't be able to enter anything because they don't require a value. Next. As we mentioned in the last few webinars, Apprise checks your data and will email you if they have any questions, and they're intended to help ensure your report is accurate. And this they look at things within the report, so do the numbers match up within the report. They look at the notes that you include, so we encourage you to use notes as much as possible. And we also compare it against other reports. Does it make sense given what you've reported in some of your other data, with some of your other data? When it's complete, you will be notified. Next. Some final reminders. Many of these are things that Dan talked about. This is a slide we actually included in the last webinar as well, and it just highlights what you need to be doing to get the data you need for Section 5, in particular your energy expenditure data from vendors. If you have not already started this, it's something you should be starting very, very soon, and if you need help, please reach out to us. We have a lot of resources. We can point you in the right direction or help you step by step. This slide is kind of a repeat, but once, as Dan mentioned, you're going to be using Excel and Basecamp to submit this, and we expect that you'll all be getting a template to use in the coming week from OCS. The current due date is still January 31st, and you should see additional communication coming out soon about this report. As usual, if you are unsure about being able to get this in on time, or you would like an extension, you should be calling your liaison to negotiate that. These are different resources and we would point you in the right direction of. This first is, I think, one of the most thorough places you can go to look at details for each report. It gives you IMs and instructions and the form templates, as well as past training on every report that's due in the LIHEAP program. And so I'd encourage you to go take a look at that along with these other resources that we've linked to. Next. As Dan mentioned, for those of you who want kind of a second go at this or have other staff that would like to attend and listen, we have 2 additional webinars coming up. For Module 1, the grantee survey, we'll have another webinar on January 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and then we'll have this webinar repeated on January 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern. So you're welcome to attend again if you want to hear this again, or to send additional staff who might be helping you with this report. And we'd like to end with a poll here. How helpful was this webinar in understanding what is needed to complete the FY 2022 Performance Measures Report? Was it not at all helpful, not too helpful, somewhat helpful, or very helpful?
And while you're doing this, we can see, Nicholas, if we have any questions that we can start to answer while people are filling out the poll.
Yes. So one of the first questions we received: in the past, we have been unable to procure data from our delivered fuel vendors for a variety of reasons. Is there anything you can do to help us with this?
Yeah, that's something that is not unique. That's something that a lot of states have to work on over time, is how to get data from delivered fuel companies that may be smaller, may not have a data system. And that's something that Melissa and I have worked with a lot of states on. I think if first thing is you would need to make sure you have a relationship with them, and materials to explain what you're requesting, and start to work on that relationship over time. But Melissa and I can maybe speak to you and look at how we can work on identifying which are the most important, the larger ones, and how to approach them. Anything else there, Melissa?
No, I mean, I think that last piece is really important, that we have identified certain vendors that are more likely to give folks data. And so if you need help, we can at least get you started with those folks.
Looks like we're not receiving any more responses, so I'll go ahead and close that poll.
Okay. All right, that's good to hear. Any other questions, Nicholas?
Yes. I thought that CARES funds could not be spent in FY 2022. Why is there still a separate module for this funding type?
They cannot be they had to all have been obligated by the end of 2021. That doesn't necessarily mean that there couldn't have been some that were not yet sent out as benefits that might have gone out early in 2022. So that module's been left there in case of that scenario, but for most states, I think you will not have to report information on that area. And the ARPA 2C tab is where you'll have to focus in addition to the main tab.
Why don't we have to report Infrastructure Act funds separately in our performance measures report, module 2, like we had to do for the grantee survey?
The reason for that is that, OCS wanted to be cognizant of your reporting burden for you and for all grant recipients. The Infrastructure Act funds are a smaller amount of funds, and they made the decision not to have to collect additional information on households in the household report related to Infrastructure Act funds. You don't have to report anything separate, and you don't have to report anything separate here in the performance measures. The grantee survey module 1 is focused on funding information. So that does separately ask how the infrastructure fund acts were obligated, to know which areas they were obligated to. All right, I think Nicholas, since it's 3, if there's any other questions, we'll follow up with them. Again, we'll have the repeat webinars coming up. So if there's any other questions or you want to email us, I think our contact information is on the next slide. So here's how you can reach us if you'd like to reach us. And we're here to answer any questions. We appreciate your time today. And anything else, Melissa?
Nope, thanks for your time. We appreciate it.
All right, have a great day and have happy holidays if we don't talk to you.